is going to change accordingly. And tariffs and economics we just touched upon. The essential questions for this unit, which we were looking at, was the Civil War inevitable? In other words, were these compromises doomed all along, or, for example, could better, more effective compromises have been reached, or simply could the South have seceded peaceably? We're also concerned with the question about whether it is true, or in what sense it's true, that in order to understand America, you have to understand the Civil War. We're going to be touching back on the Civil War or Civil War era issues constantly throughout the rest of the course. And of course, we're also trying to look more broadly than just the war itself, but at how sacrifices were made by all Americans. Lincoln said at one point, "Physically speaking, we cannot separate," which gets at the reasons behind the idea that, well, it's perhaps impossible to just let the South secede. There's tons of issues at play here. Partly, what Lincoln is getting at is that there's really no natural boundaries between the two potential nations. In fact, there's a lot of natural resources and boundaries that they share. They'd have to decide which future states were let into the Union or the Confederacy, and potentially there could be wars down the road because of Western expansion. Beyond this, we've got the issue of the Mississippi River coming north to south right through both potential countries. And beyond that as well, we've got national debt still left over even from Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 and those type of things, which would have to be divvied up or not between the two potential countries, as well as this time is going on. We've got the Fugitive Slave Act in play, which is kind of the federal government's way of saying, well, the North has to send back slaves that run away from the South. If they're two different countries, there's really no reason for that law to be honored, because then it would be a matter of international extradition. So potentially slaves could just start escaping and with no fear of extradition, no fear of being sent back. Lots of serious issues with these possible disunited states, including the fact that Europe had an interest in not necessarily taking over one country or the other of the North or the South if they were to separate, but regaining the influence, the imperial influence it wanted over the Western Hemisphere, especially especially South America, South and Central America, which under the Monroe Doctrine, the United States has more or less for the few decades leading up to the Civil War been more or less protecting from European power grabs. Secession itself. Now, if you're from the South, this might surprise you, but slavery is probably not going to be the reason that you think or say that you're seceding. There's all sorts of reasons for secession, but really we're looking at the states' rights and federal power issue. And as far as the South's concerned, the federal government is just kind of out of control, and is making decisions that are not benefiting the South. Slavery's in there. Potentially the federal government could outlaw slavery in all of the United States, as eventually happens. And I'm sure that's in some people's mind. But the more core, the more fundamental issue is that states' rights issue. the problem with the federal government's power. Fort Sumter is the first military action, I guess you could say, of the war, although it's not considered part of the war per se. So it's not the first military engagement, because the Confederates are basically shelling an empty fort. But as we see, the fort, the loss of the fort really served the North's best interest, because Lincoln was able to make headway in saying, the South is now the aggressor. The Southern forces have attacked us, and this led to increased interest in recruitment in the volunteer army in the Union, and in a sense provoked the war that resulted in the South's violent loss of this cause they're fighting for, rather than possibly an uneasy but somewhat peaceful secession. This kind of makes that impossible. It makes war, in one sense, at least at this juncture, inevitable. We looked a good bit at these questions, but probably the most important here is that in the years leading up to the war, and then as the war began, Lincoln was able to keep the border states in the Union. This is huge, because really the border states are critical, whichever side they go with, partly because they've got really the natural and population resources and industrial resources that most of the rest of the North has, but the South lacks. I mean, it's one of the weaknesses of the South. So the border states have that manufacturing capacity that, if they had been if they had also seceded, would have benefited the South enormously. But these states also have slaves for the most part. So Lincoln has to walk that line between not making the war about slavery, at least in the beginning, and somehow or another ensuring the border states feel like the war is about keeping the Union together. Trying to get the border states into the Southern fold, I guess you could say, is a major political effort of the South during this whole time, but they never succeed in getting that. Although there's some funny instances in which, for example, Missouri stays within the Union, but the governor of Missouri starts secretly planning, because he wanted to secede. He starts secretly planning to hand over all the artillery in St. Louis to the South. Additionally, we've got Native Americans being used by both sides, but primarily by the Confederacy. And there's some reasons for the support of these sort of the five civilized tribes, they're called, the five major tribes in the southern states, for their support for the South. Partly because some held slaves and they saw a common cause there, and partly because the Southern government offered them representation in the new Confederacy as well. Immigrants played a large role, almost entirely on the side for the North, in terms of manpower, both as far as supplying soldiers and supplying industrial strength, just labor for the industry of the North. New immigrants from Europe especially play a key role for the North, and we did just mention how Native Americans were sort of used primarily by the South.